Good morning and welcome to our webinar, FineReader Engine Deployment in Docker Containers. My name is Vigilia Kuhn, and I'm working as a Technical Product Marketing Manager at ABBYY. And today I will host this webinar together with my colleague, Stefan Schmeinter. He is working as a Solution Architect at ABBYY, and he will then take the part after me and demonstrate you live FineReader Engine deployment in Docker container. As already announced, this is a technical webinar with key focus on specific scenario, how we can deploy engine in virtual environment and especially as an example in Docker container. You are right here if you are considering or intending to run FineReader Engine in Docker containers and really would like to see live how to do it. Before we start, a couple of administrative information. We are recording this webinar and you will receive the recording in 1 or 2 days after the webinar. Your lines are muted just to avoid background noise, as we have luckily very many attendees. For the questions, please use the chat panel. We will answer your questions either directly in the questions panel during the presentation, or if we will have some time left after the presentation, we will go through the questions and answer these then directly. In case we won't manage to answer your questions, please be assured that the questions are logged and we will contact you directly and answer your questions. So we have 2 key topics on our agenda today. I will introduce you our new licensing mechanism, which is specifically designed for FineReader Engine deployment into virtual environments. And then you will see in action how fast and easy it is, FineReader Engine deployment in Docker container. So we are focusing on FineReader Engine in this webinar and how you can leverage this SDK to bring your product to the market in the short and fast way. And we are going to demonstrate this using the example of deploying Engine in Docker container. Before we show you how to do this, I would like to really very briefly introduce the FineReader Engine, especially to those who don't know our product yet, as we have today not only customers joined, but really many people, people new to ABBYY who don't know our product yet. So what is ABBYY FineReader Engine? FineReader Engine is a software development kit, our flagship product for developers. So you can integrate it into your application. In this way, your application, so applying ABBYY technology, is capable to retrieve and access textual information. Very typical traditional usage scenario is document archiving. For example, converting scanned image documents to searchable PDFs for indexing or creating digital archives. But FineReader Engine is, of course, not limited only to the document management area. We see many customers from area of the automated quality control, machine vision, or robotic process automation, which use text extraction from machine displays, computer screens, product packaging, in order to automate the quality control process or to enable to automate other processes. So the text extraction is not anymore limited to books or documents, but since years, it finds its usage in many other areas. So which technologies is FineReader Engine providing? This slide lists the main technologies of the FineReader Engine. This also very briefly, when you integrate FineReader Engine into your application, you can extend it with recognition capability, including optical character recognition, so extracting machine printed text, also intelligent character recognition, so-called hand printed text, which you usually can see on the forms filled in manually. Also optical checkmark recognition, barcode recognition. The next major area, as already mentioned, is the document and PDF conversion to convert scanned documents into searchable PDFs. For archiving purposes. We as well offer basic data extraction and processing of business cards. The other quite new and would say revolutionary technology is the document classification in FineReader Engine. We also provide powerful tools for image pre-processing to enhance the image quality, which is really essentially important for to achieve high accuracy result. And FineReader Engine is available for Windows, Linux, and Mac operating systems. And our product, FineReader Engine, is continuously improved and developed, and the current and the latest major version is version 12, which we have on the market. It was introduced to the market last year in May. We added very many new features. Some of them I would like to highlight here also very briefly. So Engine was updated to the latest OCR technology cycle, which now uses several machine learning and artificial intelligence technologies and bring as a result higher recognition and layout reconstruction accuracy. The document classification, as already mentioned, is really revolutionary. It was completely re-implemented compared to FineReader Engine 11. Now it is using machine learning and artificial intelligence technologies. We added a ready-made functionality for the extraction of the data in machine-readable zones, so-called MRZ lines from ID documents, which is really very important, especially for the customer onboarding scenario, to extract that data quickly from ID documents. Another major new functionality is support of Office document formats such as Word, PowerPoint, and other Office formats as new document input format. And last but not least, a new licensing option was introduced, which allows deployment on FineReader Engine within the cloud and virtual environments, including Docker containers. And why do we actually care about these environments? The answer is actually quite simple. It's a fact that the use of virtual and cloud environments has been continuously increasing for many years. And we see as well, since a few years, the trend towards the use of containers technology is really rapidly increasing. As the advantages, of course, are obvious. Hardware cost savings, IT efficiency, faster deployment of applications, and higher performance of applications, just because the virtual environments can be really very easily and fast scaled. And the great news for you is that FineReader Engine is ready to leverage the mentioned advantages and to be used in different virtual environments, including Docker containers and cloud infrastructure. In the next few minutes, I will introduce you our new licensing mechanism, online license, which was specifically designed for FineReader Engine usage in these virtual environments. The so-called online license, the new license mechanism, was introduced in the version 12 of the engine, and it is a special license type originally designed for FineReader Engine usage in virtual machines, Docker containers, and cloud, but actually it can be used in any environment supported by FineReader Engine. In contrast to our common software license type of FineReader Engine, the online license doesn't require license activation, and it's not bound to a particular machine. So it is best suited for use in Docker containers and virtual environments, especially when there is a need for a flexible use of hardware to scale and orchestrate a large number of tasks for document processing, for example, changing the size of data storage and adding a computing power to virtual machine, as well as starting new instances to scale the application. So have no impact on the license itself because the license is not bound to a machine. And in addition, the license allows concurrent usage, meaning that one license file can be used on many instances running FineReader Engine, and you can scale your application according to your needs and leverage the virtual infrastructure to achieve higher performance. Yeah, and how it is possible? Online license has a page counter, so it allows processing a certain page volume during some defined period of time, for example, pages per year or pages per month. And several instances of FineReader Engine can share one license with the one license counter. The diagram on the right-hand side demonstrates the concept of the online license. As you can see, the instances running an application with FineReader Engine and sharing one license are communicating with the licensing service hosted by ABBYY. In this way, the license counter information is periodically synchronized over the internet. It's synchronized over the internet in some periodically, as I said, but of course the workstations can work autonomously for some period of time. For example, in case of developer and runtime license, it's per default 12 hours. The online license can as well be used in a network configuration. For example, when machines have restricted or no direct access to the internet, for example, due to high security policies or some other reasons, the network configuration is best suited since only one machine would need to have internet connection. As you can see in the diagram, several FineReader Engine instances in a local area network are connecting to network license server, and only one machine with a network license server is communicating with ABBYY licensing server. So to have a secure internet connection, the network license server could be set up to use a proxy server or even be placed in very secure environment in so-called demilitarized zone. Of course, to avoid single point of failure, we would recommend to use 2 or more network license servers in this configuration. And I suppose now you're asking yourself, and what about security of the online license? And at this point, I would like to highlight here, neither user data nor documents are transferred to ABBYY. The local or also the network licensing service sends to ABBYY ABBYY licensing service only the information required to identify the license for reporting the consumed pages. And the information sent to ABBYY is encoded by specific algorithms, hash sums, independent of the hardware, and cannot be reconstructed. ABBYY receives completely anonymized information of the environment where the online license is used. And just to mention a few parameters which we get to identify the license and which is encoded. This is the instance ID where the engine is running, device ID, license ID, and of course then the counter information. The ABBYY licensing service is hosted on Microsoft Azure data centers in the European Union in a fail-safe manner with backup servers so that service availability is ensured. We guarantee that the quarterly uptime percentage for the ABBYY licensing service will not be less than 99%. So with the online license, FineReader Engine is ready to be deployed in any environment, including virtual machines and containers. And now I believe you are all excited to see the FineReader Engine in action. And at this point, I will hand over to my colleague, Stefan Schmeinter.
Yes, thank you, Vigilia. Just a second. Okay, so, well, thank you, Vigilia. My name is Stefan Schmeinter, as Vigilia already mentioned. And now it's my part to take over and to actually show you the deployment of our of the FineReader Engine in the Docker environment. So in this case, Vigilia mentioned it already. Docker, of course, is not is just a sample of technology for any container environment. But of course, FineReader Engine is not limited or restricted to Docker. There is other vendors as well. But since we actually received a lot of requests and especially about Docker, we thought it might be the best idea to actually show the Docker implementation. Okay, so this demo is Linux based. So we will use the FineReader engine for Linux, as Docker is actually a native Linux application or service. In the meantime, though, there is Docker also available for Windows, but we decided it would be the best fit to actually show the Linux deployment in a Docker environment. Yes, I prepared 2 use cases that I would like to show to you. And I'm going to go through some steps what we need to do to set up our our FineReader engine in our Docker container for both use cases. And just with that being said, I'm not going through to actually install Docker or talk about what Docker exactly is. I'm assuming you've heard of it basically, and you know what it is. I'm just going to describe what steps are necessary in order to get everything up and running. Okay, so the required steps that we need to do in order to deploy our FineReader engine in a Docker container are described in the following. So, what is our goal when we want to work with Docker? Well, basically, we want to work with containers. That's our main goal. How to get to a container? We first need to have an image, and how to get to an image, basically, and a Docker image, we need to have a Docker file. So what this exactly means, so the Docker file is basically a text file that describes basically how our image should look like, how our Docker image should behave. And it is basically a set of commands that we could also type in any Linux command prompt. And it basically describes, for example, like what operating system is used, or what operating system we want to use in our images or actually in our containers. We can install any necessary dependencies or any requirements we want to use. And also we can describe the behavior, what should happen when we actually create an image or when we create a container. What the image itself is basically what I just said, described in the Docker file. So it is based on the Docker file that we write in the first step, and Docker can automatically create the image based on the Docker file. So and one of the most important things I still need to mention, or I want to say actually, is that the image Docker creates based on the Docker file is created in a layer architecture. That means every step that we describe in our Docker file, so for example, step 1, the operating system, step 1, the dependencies, and so on, every step is an actual, is an own layer, and the layers are all stacked up on top of each other, and they're all in a kind of a read-only mode. So once they have been created, they cannot be changed. The image will not be changed. And the great thing, basically, or which is actually a benefit of working with containers itself, is to have containers who use their own file system. That means the file system itself is provided by the image. And lastly, the container is actually the instance of our image, or yeah, the runtime of our image, if you want to call it. And the main difference, or the most important aspect, or the main difference between the container and the image is actually the additional writable layer that is added up. So that means the container takes all the layers of the image that we created earlier, and it just adds a new layer that can actually be where actually data can be written to. That means all writes to the container that add new data or that change existing data, for example, are actually stored in this writable layer. But when a container is deleted at some point, the writable layer will also be deleted, but of course the underlying image will remain unchanged. And that is basically one of what I believe key benefits to have one of the key benefits of actually using containers, I think. because all the changes that are stored in the writable layers, still multiple containers can share one image and have all the will remain the same data state basically. Okay, so what I would like to show you are basically two use cases. How we're going to deploy Docker, how we're going to deploy FineReader Engine in our Docker environment. So first of all, I just want to say, I personally think that there is no best practice or best way of how to use containers, because I think it's always a way of the use case. So really it depends on the scenario that you're trying to build basically. But for example, so the first use case we were gonna do, well, actually a simple setup where we're gonna install the FineReader Engine, so the SDK, including the licensing service, so a complete installation inside one Docker container. So for example, what could a sample use case look like? Why would I do that? Why would I want to install the licensing server actually on the container together with the environment, with the FineReader Engine development environment? So for example, if I would want to offer like OCR services to multiple of my customers, I decide I want to have each image basically, or each Docker image unique for my customer, and inside this image I have all the customer required changes and all the setup the customer needs or requires, and basically I have one image for every customer, and I start the container from this image. So all the licensing information are already stored in there, the licensing service again as well. For example, this might be a use case. For a different use case, actually the simplest one I could just think of is, it's actually the easiest setup. So even if you're just if you don't know if you want to work with container at all, but you're curious about it, you just want to test it, or you're thinking about adding new functionality to your environment, it's just the easiest setup. And why not just make use of the new online license feature of the ABBYY licensing service? So just have everything installed on a Docker container. It is the simplest setup basically. And after starting a container, we start the licensing service and everything is up and running. All right, so this will be use case number one that we're going to go through. Use case number two, let me describe it to you as well really quickly and then jump into the live demo. Use case number two will be similar, only that we will install a Docker container only containing the SDK, basically, the FineReader Engine, but we won't install the licensing service. We will basically just point the we will point the IP address to the licensing server that will be outside of our Docker container. So I have actually FineReader Engine and the licensing service installed on my Linux host machine, basically, and we will just communicate with the licensing service outside the container. Of course, there's different use cases as well for this scenario. For example, if I actually want to basically a scenario that my colleague described earlier, if we want to have multiple working containers, for example, that I want to use for load balancing scenarios, and I have just one licensing service in my background that communicates with all the containers, that might be an appropriate use case. Also, what I keep hearing more often, that actual development process also takes place, or the development process sometimes is moved to a Docker environment. I think that's a very interesting thought, because especially when developing in teams, for example, actually developing on Docker containers might make a lot of sense. So because it can be very easily assured that every developer actually starts at the same system state. Everybody starts with the same container, and everybody's at the same state basically, like the other. So again, there's just different use cases where the deployment of the containers and of the FineReader Engine in the container environment just might make more sense. And these two use cases we're going to go through. So use case number one, installing everything together, including the licensing service in one Docker container. Use case number two, having a Docker container with our FineReader engine that communicates to the network license server installed outside the container on my actual Linux host machine. Okay, so with this being said, let me just open up my Linux host machine. Okay. So in this case, I've prepared in this case it's a Fedora virtual machine. I just opened the file system right here. I have two folders. One is Linux in and Linux out. You probably already guessed it. One will be Linux in will be the use case number one with the licensing service inside the container. Linux out will be use case number two, licensing service outside the container. Okay, let's start with use case number one, and let's take a look what we have prepared and what we actually need to get everything up and running. So I mentioned earlier, the first step will be the description of the Docker file. The Docker file that describes our image, what we actually want to do, what we want to, how our image should look like. I prepared this Docker file, and let's go through it quickly because it's actually very easy to read through, and we will understand what happens basically, what we want to do. So, okay, I opened the Docker file of my first use case, and I'm just gonna go quickly over the steps that we're gonna execute here. So first of all, we start with the operating system that we want to use later in our containers. Basically, in this case, it's an Ubuntu image. Second step, we set up a environment variable for FineReader Engine. We will need this later on for well, basically to start a code samples, for example, or yeah. Next step, and keep in mind, as I mentioned earlier, all these steps again are basically layers. So one action is performed and stacked onto the layer before. So these are actually the steps that we're going to take. Third step will be we will get all the dependencies and Linux updates, for example, like the G++, the C++ compiler, because we're gonna recompile one sample basically in our container after it is launched. Therefore, we need some dependencies. Also, the make development tool, for example. Okay, so all the operating system and library and dependencies done in the first steps. Then we actually start with the deployment of our use case, and we copy some files into our container, or actually in our image, basically. So first, we're gonna copy our FineReader Engine release 3, so the installation file, basically the installation shell script. We copy it into a temp folder on our image. Also, we have our license activation token. Again, our like Vigilia mentioned before, we will use our online license for this case, which doesn't have to be activated. It's just perfect use case in this scenario. So we will copy the activation token of our license. I prepared a deploy script and a run script that we will also copy onto the image. And actually, we're gonna execute the deploy script, and we're gonna pass some parameters to it. Let me quickly show you how the deploy script actually looks like. It's very easy. I'm just gonna open it right here. And actually, the only thing we're gonna do in our deploy script, I just specified some variables right here, and we're actually just gonna install the FineReader Engine. Well, in this deploy script, we're just gonna call the FineReader Engine installation script, and we're gonna execute the silent installation of FineReader. We pass the installation folder, we pass the license path, we pass the license password of our online license. We specified it's a developer installation, and we pass the project ID. So typical parameters that we need to specify on when we install FineReader Engine, basically. After it has been hopefully successfully installed, we will switch folder and go to our FineReader Engine's code samples folder, and we go to the command line interface. This will be the sample that we're gonna test, and we're actually gonna call the make call and recompile the command line interface so that we can use it. So this is everything that happens in the deploy script. And the last call will actually be the run script that I also copied to the image. And let me show this as well. The run script, the only thing it does, it basically starts the licensing service. So after a container is created, we need to start the licensing service. And then we will actually call our code sample that we created or that we compiled earlier with the deploy step. And we switch to the folder of our command line interface sample, and we call it. And basically, we're gonna convert or run OCR on a demo file, on a demo TIFF, and we run OCR on it. We specify we want a PDF document out of it, and it should be saved as a demo.pdf inside our command line interface folder. Okay, so that's basically it. Yes, it's not too complex, and let's see how it looks like in action. So actually, I'm just going to open a terminal inside my Linux folder. I need to activate the root permissions here. Okay, and now the first step, we have our Docker file already created. I mean, it's been there, but we wrote our Docker file, and now based on this Docker file, we want to create a Docker image. That means I am in my Linux in folder, so right here where the Docker file exists actually, and I'm gonna call the command docker build to actually build the image, parameter t, so that we can actually give it a name or a tag. And I'm gonna name it Linux in as well. And one important thing that I always keep forgetting, important to actually put the dot behind so that it knows it should use the folder where we started this command. So it looks for a Docker file in this folder. So let's start this. So this will take a second, but not too long. It will basically perform all the steps that are described in the Docker file. Let's see. Okay, it started. Step one started with the Ubuntu, so with the operating systems. So it's pulling a Ubuntu image basically. All right, it's done. Second step, third step. Okay, now the dependencies and all the dependencies and requirements that we described are being installed. In the meantime, it will take like maybe a minute, not even. But in the meantime, let me just open up real quick the help of our FineReader Engine. I wanted to mention because the only special thing basically that happens from a FineReader side right now when creating the image is the silent installation of the FineReader Engine. And if you're curious about the silent installation, you can read everything about it basically in the help file of the FineReader Engine as well. So with every installation of FineReader Engine, a help file will be rolled out, will be installed, and at the section distribution, installing the library, you could actually find the parameters that are available when installing FineReader Engine in a silent mode, or a sample command here as well. So that's it's very helpful. So let's switch back to our terminal. Okay, so step 3 was finished. All the dependencies have been installed. We're at step 4 right now, where we actually copy the FineReader Engine installation distributive, so the shell script, to our image. Okay, has been copied, as well as the deploy script, the run script, the license token. Everything is running as we expected, as we wanted to. And actually now the installation, the silent installation that I just talked about, is being executed, and the script is being installed. So should be there any second. And of course, you don't have to use the shell script. There's also like an RPM package available for FineReader Engine that you could also, of course, use depending on your Linux environment, on your operating system. Of course, that's possible. Okay, so everything has been extracted from the scripts. All the samples are being deployed, basically, all the required files. And at this step, just gonna wait until Docker finishes the process. So any second. Okay, perfect. Now it's done and the image has been created. Let's just take a look if that is really true. We can basically list the images that have been created and we see the image Linux in has just been created 12 seconds ago. Okay, perfect. So now that we have our image, we can all the critical parts are done. The image could be created, no errors. That's perfectly. That's how we want it. From this stage on, we only need to start basically a container based on our image. So that's what we're gonna do now. We're gonna call the run command, and we're gonna also specify the image basically by its tag Linux in. And once we started it, we see already the echo commands from our run script. So running the licensing service and now starting the FineReader Engine sample of the command line interface. And it will actually stop after the conversion. So there we go. These are basically the steps that the FineReader Engine itself is performing. So the pre-process, the analyzing analyzing, recognition, and so on. And last step, saving the results. So the process has been completed, and we see now that we're actually connected to our container. So this is the ID of our container that we just launched, and the process is finished, and we stopped in our command line interface folder. So let's just take a look if everything actually was performed as we wanted to. So let me just go back into our Linux in folder. There's actually the TIFF file to give you an idea of what we just did. There is this demo TIFF, two-page TIFF file that we try to OCR and to save into a searchable PDF. And let's see if FineReader Engine actually did this. I'm just gonna display what files are in my folder, and we see there is this demo TIFF in my command line interface folder. And let me quickly transfer it to our Linux folder so that we can actually see the PDF file. So I can copy. Hang on. I can't actually. Need to squeeze down the image terminal a little bit. Okay, now I can see. I actually need the ID of my Docker. Yes. And now I'd like to copy a file from inside my Docker container out to my host system so that I can actually see the result. So I need to go to the folder where actually the command line interface is actually stored. So the demo PDF was created. We saw it earlier in the folder, and we'd like to move it to the host system's file system. Okay, so we just transferred this demo PDF from our container, And let's just take a look at it. Okay, it looks good. The same TIFF, so the same image, but now fully OCR'd and searchable basically. Okay, that's nice. That's actually what I wanted to show for first use case. So very easy setup, install everything in a container and have it up and running. Of course, I don't have to specify everything in my Docker file or in my scripts on image creation. Basically, it's just a way of how I can do it. But of course, now that I'm in my container right now, I can do anything else I want as well. For example, it is a fully functional environment, so I can just go back, for example, and go into a different sample, and actually this is a hello sample, and I can actually just call the make file because I have my development tools installed, and I can actually recompile a different sample and just call the sample I just created, and it works as well. So of course, I can work with the FineReader engine just as in any other Linux environment. Okay, so with this being said, this is actually the first use case I wanted to go through. I'm going to stop this container. All right. And let's take a look at use case number 2. It will be, I'm not going to go through all the details again because it's very, very similar. I'm just going to show you the differences. So let's switch to use case number 2. Yes, it looks very different. We have the same license in this case. We have the same installation folder. We have a deploy script and a run script. Let's take a look at the Docker file. Let's just take a quick look at the Docker file. It is actually very, very similar. Again, we start with the operating system, environment variable, dependencies. We deploy this. The only difference is that our deploy script has basically one more parameter that specifies where the licensing service is located. And in this case, I just specify the IP address of my actual Linux host system. So yeah, and by doing this, the licensing service will be FineReader Engine will be configured to use the licensing service located on this IP address. That is actually the only difference. And let's do this real quick. Oh, hang on, I need my terminal again. And I need to go to the Linux out folder. And in here, I'm going to do the same thing I did earlier. I need my Docker command, build. Want to add a tag to it, and that's called Linux out. And this is what I mentioned earlier. I always forget the dot because I am in my Linux out folder, and I need to tell the Docker that you should look for the Docker file in this folder. Okay, so basically same thing will happen like it did before. Only difference, oh, we still have it open actually. Only difference that we actually added a new parameter to the deploy script that will use the licensing service. The rest of the parameters, just in the order like it is described in the deploy script, actually the installation file of FineReader Engine, the installation path, the path to our license, the password of our license token in this case, and my customer project ID that I receive when I get a FineReader Engine license. And lastly, the IP address of the licensing service. Okay. Let's see how far we are. Okay, since this is still going, it's at step 3, I guess, at installing the dependencies. Yes, now it's copying the FineReader Engine and installing it. In the meantime, let's just check and make sure that actually we have a licensing service running on our host system. Otherwise, the sample would not work, of course. So let me switch real quick into my actual So on my Linux host machine, let me switch onto my FineReader Engine installation folder. There's the licensing service. Okay, and in here, I'm just gonna call the licensing service status just to be sure. Okay, so ABBYY licensing service is running on my Linux host machine. That's good news because we're gonna need it. And when we go back, it's still at the installation part of the FineReader engine. It is a big engine, a lot of technology, a lot of content that has been extracted and installed. So it takes a second. Okay. Actually, one last thing I wanted to point out. Once the second use case, so the Linux out use case, will be ready, the run script will be executed as well. And we're going to take a look at that because right here there's also one difference compared to the first use case. We don't have to start, of course, the licensing service again because the licensing service is not in the Docker container, but we're just going to call the command line interface code sample, and we're going to call it and give the demo TIFF as a parameter and the same command like before, basically, only without actually starting the licensing service. So that's one of actually the only difference besides. Okay, let's see. The image has been created. It's finished. Let's take a look here as well. Okay, we have now, beside our Linux in, we now also have our Linux out image. And again, let's start our image or our container. Okay. Now, again, it's not starting the licensing service, but it's just starting the command line sample where it is using the licensing service outside the container. Let's just give him a second. Okay, yes, looks good. Opening the image, analyzing, recognizing, and saving the results. Okay. Yeah, two very similar use cases, but still very different ways of deploying it. And again, as I mentioned before, personally, I think there is no best way. It really depends on the scenario or the use case, whether to have everything combined in a Docker container or to have the licensing service outside the container, or maybe even having the licensing service have it running on a different Docker container and have just the containers communicate with each other. That would be possible as well. So really, it depends on the use case. And with this being said, I'm actually finished with my live demo part. Just gonna switch back to the slide, and yeah, at this point, I'd like to ask if there's any questions. We will actually see if we can answer questions as we go right away. Otherwise, if questions come to your mind later this day, if you maybe later at lunch or at dinner, you can't stop thinking about deploying FineReader Engine in a Docker environment, I will be very happy to receive some information or some questions from you. Just feel free to contact me when you want to. In the meantime, I'm not sure how many questions we have. Or if Vigilia, if you have any questions that we could answer.
I see there is one question regarding the password in your Docker file, but I think I saw and you mentioned there is also you passed the password for the online license.
Yes, so I passed the activation token actually, and the password that is connected to this activation token, I passed this as a parameter, the password itself. Yes.
Also, there was a question regarding the size of the Docker container, and I think I saw in your demo it was about 4 GB in both cases, in Linux in and Linux out.
Yes. Well, yes. This was just like I said, a very easy and simple setup. Of course, it probably would have made sense because we actually, upon creation of this image, we actually copied the FineReader Engine distributive, so the shell script, which is alone 1.3 GB. We copy it to our image. It probably would have made sense to remove it or to delete it afterwards. But also, there's probably it also depends on for example, on the operating system. Ubuntu is probably not the most lightweight Linux distribution there is. I can't tell which is, but yeah, there's of course ways to make it smaller, but yeah, even the FineReader Engine was 1.3 GB just for copying the distributive.
And also there's one question, I think you can answer this as well. Use case number 1, how do you run this service as non-root? So if you run the service in case 1, did you need root rights for the running the service in Docker container?
Actually we don't. It was possible just to start the licensing service without the root, basically. Yeah.
Okay, we don't need root rights in Docker container to run the licensing service in FineReader Engine licensing service on Docker container.
Yeah, correct.
And also there is one question I think you can answer as well. Are there any plans to provide official Docker image of FineReader Engine?
Actually, we've heard this question. I've had this request earlier. So to this day, it's not really possible, or depending on the architecture of the technology, basically, it's not possible to have like one ready-made Docker image or a Docker container that everybody could use for testing, because as you saw in the deployment of the image file, so when writing the Docker file, we already connected the FineReader Engine actually to the customer project ID, to the license file, and so on. And so it's not possible to have like a generic container that is already running FineReader Engine, where we can afterwards change all the information. I think it would actually, I think it's probably more work to just change the license afterwards of a container instead of just changing the parameter in the Docker file and creating the image from start. I think that's even more convenient.
Okay. I think all questions were answered at the moment. I cannot see any further open questions. Thank you, Stefan, very much. It was really a great demo. I hope you all enjoyed the demo and you can start deploying FineReader Engine in Docker containers immediately. If you still will have any questions after the presentation, you have here Stefan contact, please contact him. Otherwise, you can, if you haven't tested Engine, so please, you can visit ABBYY.com and request FineReader Engine trial, and you will get immediately the license to work with. And at this point, we are at the end. I say thank you very much joining us today for your interest in Engine, in ABBYY, and have a nice day. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, from my side as well. Thanks for joining and have a great day. Bye-bye.